Hello everyone, my name is Tin and I will be doing a short motion analysis video on the motion that this House believes that popular media should portray climate change optimistically, emphasizing progress which has been made over alarming predictions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run first through the prop case and then through the op case, and then also generally just emphasize the steps of prep, i.e. in which order they should be taken and what their strategic purpose is, just in order for everyone to get a sense of how this motion should be prepped and how this motion should be broken down and cracked. Starting off, probably the first thing that we are concerned about is the definition of popular media. So what does popular media generally mean? I think that for the purposes of this debate, it's any form of media that's consumed by and reaching wide groups of people and wide audiences. So this probably includes mainstream media, things like, the media outlets like BBC, The Guardian, The New York Times. It probably includes all of the mainstream TV networks and channels. It includes content posted on social media. It probably includes official government media. I don't think the particular examples matter here. I think insofar as it's any type of media which is accessible to a wide amount of people and that a wide amount of people consume, it's also therefore popular media. I don't think there's much to be discussed there in terms of just general definitions, which means that we are free to jump into the analysis of the prop and the op. Starting with the prop, the first question in this debate, and generally in any debate which includes narratives, portrayals, media reporting, some kind of representation or characterization of a particular phenomenon or a particular narrative or discourse, the first question is, how is this messaging going to look? So when we say that popular media is going to portray it optimistically and emphasize progress that's going to be made, we have a vague idea of what this means. But we need to specify, what kind of messaging is this going to be? What kind of messaging are these media outlets going to employ? And how do we think this is going to look? And this is where we already start thinking about preemptives, because I think the obvious op argument that springs to anyone's mind is just saying, if you are going to report overly optimistically, you're going to create complacency. You're going to create a feeling in people's minds that climate change is a problem that's already being efficiently dealt with and therefore does not require further effort, which is going to harm the fight to stop climate change. I think this is something that the government can effectively preempt and exclude from the debate by framing smartly what optimistic reporting is going to mean. So what I would say immediately right off the bat is that optimism does not necessarily mean complacency. I would say that the way this messaging is going to look is that it's going to make clear that the fight is still in progress. It's a fight which hasn't finished. We're going to emphasize all of the progress that has been done. We're going to laud these efforts. We're going to say, look at all of the amazing things we've done in stopping climate change. However, we're still going to emphasize the need for continued efforts. In other words, the reason why we are optimistic is because we are currently undertaking these efforts, and as long as we continue to undertake them, we're going to have a good shot at beating climate change, and therefore we have reasons for optimism. In other words, this optimism is premised and preconditioned on these efforts continuing, on policies continuing to be made, on individuals continuing to join the fight. So we can emphasize the progress that we are making, but we can also say that this progress only gives us optimism as long as the progress continues to happen. So what this means, for example, to be more specific, when we report on certain goals of the Paris Agreement that have been reached, we can say we are working at an amazing pace. If we continue to fulfill the other goals of the Paris Agreement at this pace, we are going to be able to reverse or avert the consequence of climate change. We have emphasized the progress in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, but we have also emphasized that we need to continue fulfilling these goals. If a country's media outlet reports on the government doing good policies, for example, the government was able to reduce CO2 emissions, or the government was able to switch to renewable energy to some extent, what we're going to say is this is amazing work from the government. As long as the government continues working in this way, we are going to be able to achieve a sustainable and greener future. However, the government needs to continue to pass policy, needs to continue to enact legislative change. So what this means in general is we're trying to exclude the op attack of we are creating complacency. The way we are excluding this is by saying the optimism is premised on what we are doing currently continuing to be done. We can still say that the fight is not over. We just have to be optimistic about the outcome of the fight. And we are still fulfilling the burden on government. This also means that we can still talk about the consequences should we stop to combat climate change or should we reverse direction. So we can say, should we not combat climate change efficiently? horrible things are going to happen. We are going to have the icebergs melting. We are going to have sea levels rising. We are going to have unsustainability in terms of energy sources. However, this is not something we have to be concerned about. As long as we continue to undertake the policies we are currently continuing, we are going to have a good shot at beating climate change. So we can still say, should we reverse the course? It's going to be bad, and we can still warn people about the consequences. However, we are going to say we are optimistic that those consequences are not going to happen because we are fighting climate change in a good way, and we need to continue to do this. So a lot of what the op is going to say in terms of how emphasizing consequences is important, in terms of telling people that action is necessary is important, can be co-opted by the government side, and therefore efficiently excluded from the debate. There's one thing we need to keep in mind here, which is that this motion is a "this house believes that" motion, which means that the government does not have fiat to explicitly model in how they would like this reporting to look. So we do need to show why we think that the reporting is going to be the likely one. So if I say I want this reporting to be done in a way that's optimistic but not complacent, I still have the burden to show why the media is going to do this in this way, in this good way that I would like. I think there are two mechanisms that are strong here. First of all, insofar as we are talking on both sides about media who are obviously invested in solving the issue of climate change, and that's why they are reporting extensively on it instead of ignoring it, like for example Fox News and all of these media, it's probably likely that given that their editors, that the newspaper journalists who write there and work there, probably obviously are invested in the issue. They want to get the issue solved, which means that they will not want the people to get too optimistic, and they will want to include warnings within this optimism. It's sort of cautious optimism. I think the second mechanism is that increasingly, and particularly for these media outlets, but increasingly in general, we have a huge amount of viewers who are aware of these issues, who want to fight for climate change to be prevented or for climate change to be averted, and they are going to be able to exert pressure on these media outlets. So if the media reports too optimistically, you're going to get Facebook comments saying, look, these are unrealistic articles. You're going to get people shifting away from those media outlets. Insofar as you have a lot of currently like famous people who have a lot of power, have a lot of reach. We're talking about pop stars, actors, politicians, singers who are also actively invested in fighting climate change. They can call out these media. So somebody can tweet like on their Twitter account that's followed by millions of people saying, look, The Guardian wrote this article, I don't think it's realistic. So there's a lot of business incentives for these media not to report in a way which is too optimistic and which may be seen as complacent. So these are just mechanisms that you need to have in place because it's a "this house believes that" motion. And it's something you always need to keep in mind, which is to read the verb in the motion and to keep in mind the burden that the verb implies on the teams in the debate. In terms of arguments, I think a good way to stratify arguments, like to separate them in prep, is to look at the different groups of stakeholders we have in the debate. I think we can talk here firstly on the individual level, which is what individual people do to combat climate change, and then secondly on the structural level. This is governments, corporations, larger actors which have more political capital and more economic capital. I think firstly on the level of individual action, we need to engage in a psychological characterization of what gets people to engage in things that combat climate change. So we're talking about things like people recycling, we're talking about things like people using less potable water, people deciding to cycle to their job or to use public transport instead of driving a car, people trying to install solar panels on their house so they switch to more renewable sources of energy, all of the things that people can do on a day-to-day level to be more sustainable and to, give their own contribution to combating climate change. The problem for all of these things is that they involve some kind of cost for the person, whether it's, the financial cost of installing solar panels, whether it's just the convenience cost of, having to change the way that you go to your work, whether just changing your daily routines, remembering to recycle, remembering to separate, your garbage into, different cans and stuff like this. Which means that people do need to make some kind of effort. The problem with making this effort is that it's hard to see a cost-benefit calculus because you do not see immediate consequences of this. So when you do recycle, when you do change your routines, you do not see your life getting better for it. Because the thing is, you as an individual cannot meaningfully change anything. It needs to be an aggregate change. So it needs to be a huge amount of individuals doing this at the same time. And it takes time for the change to actually be visible. Which means that for people to undertake these individual actions, which are incredibly important for combating climate change, and this should be emphasized in the speeches, there's only so much that legislation can do and governments and corporations can do. A huge amount of pollution And a huge amount of like generally climate unfriendly consequences is a result of the aggregate actions of millions of individuals, which are also what we need to change to combat climate change. In order to get people to act on this, we need to give them some kind of benefit. So if we cannot give them a material benefit, like an immediate consequence that they can see and latch onto, we can give them a emotional benefit. Which is to say, we can give them the feeling that they are contributing to something which is larger than them. By doing something, they're creating a safer world for themselves, and a safer world, if not for themselves, then for their children. In order for us to be able to do this, we need to make the change look, firstly, feasible, and secondly, relatively proximate. If we portray climate change optimistically, and we say we've made a huge amount of progress, and if we continue down this road, we're going to solve the issue, you give people the opportunity to jump on the bandwagon and then tell themselves they're doing a good thing, and to see themselves as moral people, which is everyone wants. Like, everyone wants to see themselves as a good person, and a person who contributes not just to themselves, because we just don't like the feeling of, being selfish or other people seeing us as selfish. The comparative here, and I think it's very important in prep to explicitly name the comparative. So after you do the argument, you want to also explicitly have a couple of sentences that talk about what happens in the counterfactual world. In the comparative, if you portray this with, huge alarming predictions, which generally cause a feeling of, helplessness in people, because people don't think it's ever going to be solved. Those are things like, scientists saying that we're at a point of no return, or we might be at a point of no return because the ice caps are going to melt anyway, things like that. People feel that there's no sense in engaging in this, because, we cannot solve the problem. The problem is too big. We have been trying to solve the problem for, decades now, and nothing is happening. There's absolutely no reason for me to undertake the trade-off. And if the problem seems so big that it cannot be solved, even if it realistically can, but this is how people see it, then they will not get this emotional benefit of being like, oh, look, I'm helping to solve a problem, because they don't think the problem can be resolved in the first place. So painting it optimistically also portrays the solution as being more proximate, and therefore gets more people, I think, to be engaged in actually solving the issue. I think the second thing we can talk about on the individual level is that when we portray something as incredibly alarming, it's easy for people to disbelieve this because they will think it's over-exaggerated. And I think this works well with the framing of most climate change consequences are not something that people experience as proximate. So unless you're a climate refugee, or unless you're living in a place which is directly at risk of sea levels rising in the next 10 to 15 years, you hear about things like the ozone layer being damaged, or the air being of lower quality to breathe, or that the world in 10 or 30 or 40 or 50 years is going to look differently, but you see nothing of this. So when you hear very alarming, huge predictions, but you see nothing happening around you, it feels like it's very disproportionate. And then people are very likely to shut off. And we've seen this happen with COVID, for example, in my country of Croatia. So when COVID arrived in Europe and there was still no COVID in Croatia, the media was reporting on COVID incredibly alarming. This is literally a new plague. It's almost going to wipe us out. It's going to be incredibly hard to deal with this. We don't know what's going to happen. We're entering, potentially a medical apocalypse. And people were really afraid. And then COVID came, and COVID was a dangerous disease, which did cause problems in the medical system, which did kill a large amount of people, and unfortunately, it did cause huge problems, and it caused huge struggles for the country. But it was not the apocalypse that the media told us it was going to be. So a lot of people then, after hearing the apocalypse, being scared, and then seeing that it's not an apocalypse, now disbelieve any realistic stories about COVID. So when they hear they have to get vaccinated, when they hear that we need to have measures, we need to have masks, we need to have disinfection, but this is important to prevent the disease, they don't even do these basic things because they think the media told us this is so dangerous. It's not as dangerous as the media told us. Why should we believe them now? And I think that this effect can very easily happen here, especially because I think it's easily co-opted by populists. When populists can say, for example, Bolsonaro, who is very anti-efforts to combat climate change, can say, look, they're just trying to scare you. They're using climate change as an excuse to implement more government regulation or to take more money from you. I think the comparative is when you portray things realistically, when you actually say, look, there's progress being made, there are things that still need to be done, but we're actually going towards a solution of the problem, and you don't seem like you're over-exaggerating the issue, people are more likely to actually engage with something that seems realistic and that seems more palatable and palpable to them, rather than with very alarming stories. And I think this just disarms a potential argument coming from opposition about how viscerality gets more people to engage. And lastly, I think on the structural level, a good argument is to say that when you emphasize something as progress, this means that you need to attribute this progress to someone. So you need to give credit. So when you're saying we're making amazing progress, you're going to say, we are going to, applaud the progress made by the government of France in doing this, or we are going to applaud this change made by Google or Apple or, Royal Dutch Shell or any other corporation who has done things to accommodate the fight for climate change. Which means that when you are portraying this optimistically, you create a bandwagoning incentive. Because corporations and governments know that if they do these things, the media is going to actively praise them and put them on a pedestal for doing these things, and they can get good publicity. And know that all of this costs. So for a corporation to, switch to completely recycled materials and, reduce the use of plastic, or for them to switch to renewable energy, or to do things like carbon offsetting if they're an airplane company, all of these things are costly. So in order for corporations to engage in this, we need to give them a comparative benefit. The comparative benefit, I think, is the good publicity, when you can emphasize the progress that's been made, and then the credit gets attributed to these corporations or to these governments who are doing this. And this has a multiplier effect, because then everyone else wants to get a piece of the cake. I think the comparative is, if you are emphasizing it very alarmingly, then the messages of how nobody is doing enough are drowning out the potential good publicity that these corporations can get. Because nobody is going to talk about how they did well, because the messages are going to be focusing on how we are not doing enough, which means that they're undertaking a cost to their business with no positive outreach to the public, with no positive publicity. So I think that emphasizing things in terms of, positive progress creates an incentive for corporations and for governments to do more to combat climate change, and therefore create positive impacts in terms of that, because they want to, rake in the publicity and they want to get the benefit out of this. And just always important to emphasize these comparatives so it's clear what your world is, but also what the counterfactual world is. I think in terms of the opposition, the first question is, again, obviously, how this is going to be done and how the messaging is going to look. And I think there are three things I would say here. First of all, it's probably likely to be visceral and visual. So it's things like, images or documentaries about, or texts about, turtles having plastic straws in their noses, or birds having their wings glued together because there was an oil spill, or we're going to have simulations, realistic simulations of how it's going to look when the sea level does rise and when it floods the cities on the coast, for example, on the east coast of the US or on the Maldives, or all of these places which are at threat from climate change. Secondly, I think we can appeal to current events, and we can point to current events that already happened and actually inconvenienced people or created very bad consequences. One thing that springs to mind is when the burning of the Amazon rainforest created dark clouds that literally shrouded Brazil in night at 3 p.m. and it looked like the literal day of judgment. And we can talk about these things and say, okay, you've experienced this. This has actually happened to people, and it's going to happen more in the future. And thirdly, we can appeal to scientific data. So we can use research, we can use numbers that say, okay, in 10 years or 20 years, this is going to happen. It's going to be very bad. And I think intuitive reaction for most judges and teams is going to be, people tend to disbelieve science a lot. I think a good intuitive example to counter this is to say, Al Gore almost won the election at the beginning of the 21st century when there was a lot less attention on climate change. He almost won the election, like he lost it by a few hundred votes, by emphasizing climate change data. And then you can just draw the comparison to today when you have a lot more awareness about this, a lot more young people who vote on these issues, and you can just intuition pump it by saying, look, if it worked then, it's more likely to work now. This is not a silver bullet, but I think just a good intuition pump to preemptively disarm all of the things about people disbelieving science. I think secondly, there's still space in opposition for complementing progress. So insofar as we still have the same incentive that government is claiming. So the media who is reporting on this, they want to encourage people to actually solve the problem. So they probably still want to encourage positive solutions, positive legislation, positive change. So they can still do things like saying, we have certain shining exceptions. Certain corporations, certain governments are doing good things. It's just not nearly good enough. And we need a lot more actors and we need a lot more effort in order for this to actually succeed, because what we are doing currently, although some are doing it well, we are still on the path to damnation if we continue down this road. So you still get some space for lauding positive examples. And I think you can maybe even co-opt the government idea of good publicity in an even better way. Because on our side, on the opposition, there are exceptions. They're shining exceptions. Everyone else doesn't care, but these very few actors are doing their bit. And given that they are more exclusive and more of an exception, this is more of comparative good publicity on the opposition than it is on the government. So always when preparing cases, think of, the benefits that can happen on the other side and how you can co-opt them. Of course, there is again the question of likelihood and why it's likely that the messaging and imaging is going to be the way we say it is. I think the answer is similar to on the government. Probably, both the media and the readership have an incentive for climate change to be solved. So when they emphasize alarming predictions, they want to emphasize them in a way that's going to get people to act. That's why they're going to have visceral messaging. That's why they're going to appeal to current events. Their readers or, famous individuals can still call them out on our side too. They can say, you need to be more alarming about this. You need to report about the actual realistic consequences which can happen because we're not doing enough. I think the same mechanism happens on the opposition as well. In terms of the arguments, and I think the opposition can run. I think, first of all, you can try to flip the psychological argument in terms of when you get individuals to act, which is to say, when people act on something, they need to have a clear cost and benefit trade-off. And this is similar to what government says. So if government runs the argument of you need to have a clear cost and benefit trade-off to act, you don't need to repeat that analysis. You can just say, we agree with government on this. Here is, however, how we achieve the trade-off. People tend to act when they are afraid that their lives are going to be changed negatively, or if not their lives, then the lives of future generations that they might care about. People are actually going to undertake the effort to, change things regarding their routines and behavior if they think it meaningfully improves their lives. And you can try to, minimize the effect of this argument on the government saying people are going to have this moral incentive to want to feel good about themselves. Yes, people like to feel good about themselves, but when it doesn't come at a cost to themselves, and all of these things do come at a more material cost, which is more palpable than the idea of just saying, I did something for climate change. But if we can convince people that in 10 years their homes might be destroyed, in 10 years they may not have daylight, in 10 years they may not have drinkable water, all of these things actually encourage action because they tell people the cost that you are, accruing out of, starting to recycle is a lot lower than the costs which are going to accrue if you and your neighbors and other people don't recycle, which I think is also a good auxiliary mechanism to claim that people who are going to be encouraged by this imagery are also likely to encourage others around them and to spread the same messaging. Like, this is not just something that I need to do. My family needs to do this. My neighbors need to do this. And you can have this kind of agitation. Sure, some people are not going to be moved on either side of the house, but the people who can be moved need to be presented with a realistic, palatable, proximate trade-off in order for them to actually act. I think the comparative is when you are portraying something as optimistic, it's easy for people to shirk responsibility. Because, okay, let's say that the government is correct in saying that people want to feel good as individuals, but they also want to avoid costs and they also want to retain routines. So if you portray things as optimistic, it's very easy for them to say, and you rationalize this as being, I would do this, to help save the world, but the world is already being saved, so there is not much that I will add to this. The process is already happening, and they've retained a good picture of themselves while not doing anything. On your side of the house, you're emphasizing the urgency for them to act. I think the second thing is how you can get more political change on the opposition side, which is to say, in order for you to get politicians actually acting on climate change, so crafting campaigns based on this, making promises and then being held to these promises at the next election cycle, or corporations actually, making pledges to change certain things and then being held to account by their consumers, you need to have it portrayed as an existential threat, something which firstly requires strong action, and secondly, and this is important for the political sphere, which is bipartisan. Insofar as not solving climate change kills people, there's no left and right here. It's a problem we need to solve. So this allows the environmentalist movement, and this allows, in general, pressure to happen on actors like politicians and corporations. Whereas on the comparative, they can dismiss this in favor of other issues. They can say we are already making progress and therefore this is not an urgent issue. Or they can try to co-opt this progress for themselves. They can say, look, this is what we've done during our reign as a party, or this is what we've done in the last 5 years as a corporation, and all of the media is praising us for this, and they can use this praise to actually portray themselves as actually having solved climate change or solving climate change without doing it. And the media allows them to create this smokescreen of saying it's either not too urgent or we've already done things and we are, in favor of being greener and more sustainable, without actually providing a real solution. The comparative is on the opposition. This is portrayed as existential, and as current efforts not being sufficient, you have consistent pressure on these people to keep acting and to keep trying to solve the problem. And some good status quo framing can be done here. Currently, there's more awareness about climate change than ever before. We have green parties in parliaments all over Europe. Even if they're not in power, they have sufficient number of seats to be kingmakers or to make certain conditions when, bargaining for laws and bills in parliaments. We have a large amount of young individuals who are being socialized into caring about the environment, who vote on this, but who are also politically political consumers, so they buy things from corporations based on whether or not they actually do something to combat climate change. This then creates incentives for corporations to do things like portray themselves as green and do policies like carbon offsetting and all of these things. Currently, we have a strong amount of political capital to fight climate change. Firstly, the reason why we have this is because a huge amount of individuals have been mobilized by the urgency. The reason why a huge amount of young individuals now boycott corporations if they are not green is because the young people think if we don't do this now, then our lives, because we are young and we're going to be in this world for 50 or 60 more years, our lives are going to be ruined. The reason why we have this capital is because of this urgency. So you can intuition pump why the urgency is important. But you can also say, given the current amount of strength the movement has globally, this is the bad moment to switch to optimism. So even if optimism is realistic, even if we are winning in the fight, we have an unprecedented amount of power concentrated in the environmentalist movement. We don't want to deflate that bubble. We want to keep the alarming messaging going, to keep the movement as strong so we can get more changes. And the last thing I think opposition can run is, I think, on the opposition side of the house, I think it's easier to just dismantle populist messaging. So this is to counter the argument coming from the prop about how populists can, easily portray you as being over-exaggerating and then say, look, this is just a ploy to get you to pay more money. I think part of the messaging on the opposition side is not just to emphasize the bad consequences for the climate, but to emphasize the bad consequences for the people themselves. Because the water has been polluted, for example, your country has to spend a huge amount of money on desalination technology or on desalinated water, like importing it from elsewhere or things like that. So you can emphasize the actual material costs to people's lives that are a result of not combating climate change efficiently. And a lot of what populists use in their rhetoric is emphasizing the material lives of individuals. Because when populists portray themselves as being the protectors of the people, they emphasize how the elites are greedy, how the elites are stealing money, how the elites are making the people poor. If you can emphasize that should we not combat climate change, the costs to ordinary people, like for their basic daily lives, are going to grow, you directly disarm the populist argument because you're able to beat them on your own turf. And I think this is a way to just garner more support for climate change, or at least to combat the trend of this support reducing in instances where you have strong populist parties like Bolsonaro in Brazil. So these are my thoughts on the motion. I hope this was helpful, and I hope this is going to be useful to people in the future.